There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a room when a predator realizes they have mistaken a wolf for a sheep. It is a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that sucks the oxygen out of the air and leaves hearts pounding in ears. This is the story of that silence. It is the story of what happened when Hollywood's last true icon, a man carved from the granite of the Old West, walked into the sanitized, fluorescent-lit world of modern daytime television and refused to play by its rules. Clint Eastwood, the man who defined cool for 3 generations, the director who captured the nuance of the human soul in films like Unforgiven and Gran Torino, found himself seated across from Joy Behar. What was scheduled to be a polite, 5-minute promotional segment for a new film devolved, or perhaps evolved, into one of the most brutal, unscripted dismantlings of the modern media machine in television history. Before we analyze the wreckage, we must understand the atmosphere. This wasn't just a celebrity interview. It was a collision of two incompatible worlds: the stoic, results-based world of traditional America and the performative, outrage-fueled ecosystem of coastal media. The segment began with the deceptive calm of a calm sea before a hurricane. The studio audience was electric, their applause genuine and raucous as Whoopi Goldberg introduced the legend. Eastwood walked out, moving a little slower than he did in his spaghetti western days, but retaining that undeniable aura of command. He wore a simple jacket, his silver hair swept back, his eyes still possessing that piercing, squinting intensity that had stared down bad guys for decades. He settled into the chair, his posture relaxed, his hands folded in his lap. To the casual observer, he looked like a grandfather ready to tell a story. To the producers in the control room, he looked like a ratings bonanza. But to Joy Behar, who sat at the end of the table with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, he looked like a target. The early minutes were standard fare. Whoopi, a professional who respects the hierarchy of Hollywood royalty, kept the conversation respectful. They discussed Eastwood's latest directorial effort, a poignant film about redemption and the difficulty of forgiveness. Eastwood spoke softly, his gravelly voice forcing the audience to lean in. He talked about the human condition, about how society is too quick to write people off, and how the most interesting stories are found in the gray areas of morality, not the black and white. Sarah Haynes listened raptly, asking about his creative process, clearly in awe of the living history sitting just a few feet away. It was a masterclass in dignity. Eastwood didn't brag. He didn't drop names. He simply spoke about the work, the way a craftsman speaks about wood or stone. However, the energy at the table was unbalanced. While the other hosts were engaged in the interview, Joy Behar was engaged in a hunt. She sat back, her arms crossed, her foot tapping a silent rhythm of impatience. She wasn't listening to his answers. She was waiting for a gap in the armor, a pause where she could insert the wedge she had been sharpening all morning. The producers had likely warned the panel to keep it light, to respect the guest's age and stature. But Joy Behar has never been one to respect boundaries when there is a political point to be scored. The moment finally came when Eastwood paused after answering a question about casting. The air in the studio seemed to curdle as Joy leaned forward, her voice dropping an octave into a tone of faux concern that everyone in the industry recognizes as the precursor to an ambush. "Clint," she interrupted, cutting off a follow-up from Sunny Hostin. "It's all very nice to talk about redemption and second chances in movies. That's very Hollywood. But let's talk about the real world for a second." The shift was jarring. The audience's collective head turned. Eastwood, who had been looking at the audience, slowly turned his gaze toward Joy. He didn't blink. He didn't recoil. He simply waited. "You talk about truth," Joy continued, emboldened by his silence. "But some would say your version of truth is a little selective. Given your history of political endorsements, don't you think it's a bit rich to sit here and lecture us on morality?" The studio went dead silent. This wasn't just a tough question. It was an accusation wrapped in a question mark. Whoopi Goldberg looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting in her seat and glancing at the producers off camera. But Eastwood didn't look at the producers. He looked directly at Joy. He offered a small, dry chuckle, a sound like boots crunching on gravel. "Rich?" he repeated, tasting the word. "I didn't know I was lecturing anyone, Joy. I thought I was answering questions about a movie. But if you want to talk about morality, we can do that. What exactly is your concern?" Joy, mistaking his calmness for weakness, pressed her advantage. She brought up the past, vague references to problematic associations, the famous empty chair speech, the support for politicians that the panel found distasteful. She threw out buzzwords like divisive and responsibility, painting Eastwood not as an artist, but as a political adversary who needed to be held accountable in her court. She smiled as she spoke, the smile of a prosecutor who believes she has the defendant cornered. "You have a platform, Clint," she lectured, wagging a finger slightly. "And when you use that platform to support people who hurt our democracy, don't you think you bear some of that guilt? Don't you think you owe an explanation to the people who buy your tickets?" Eastwood let the question hang in the air for a long, agonizing moment. He looked at Joy with an expression that wasn't anger, but rather a profound, weary disappointment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, forcing Joy to stop breathing just to hear him. "Joy," he said slowly, "I've been making movies since before color television was standard. I've told stories about cowboys, soldiers, boxers, singers, and everyday people. I've worked with every race, every creed, every political background under the sun. And you know what I've learned?" He paused, leaning forward just an inch. "I've learned that the only people who are obsessed with putting everyone into political boxes are the people who have nothing else to offer." Joy bristled, her face flushing pink. "Excuse me," she snapped. "I'm asking you about accountability. That's not putting you in a box. That's journalism." Eastwood's eyes crinkled at the corners, but the glint within them was hard as steel. "Journalism?" he asked, the words sounding foreign in his mouth in this context. "Is that what you call this? Because from where I'm sitting, this looks like a performance. You aren't asking me questions because you want to know the answers. You're asking me questions because you want a clip for Twitter. You want to be the one who took down Clint Eastwood. I am doing my job." Joy raised her voice, her composure beginning to fracture. "My job is to challenge people in power." Eastwood didn't raise his voice to match hers. He went lower. "Your job," he corrected her gently, "is to entertain. And somewhere along the way, you forgot that entertainment requires respect for the audience and the guest. You think being loud is the same as being right. You think being rude is the same as being brave." He gestured around the studio. "You invite people into this house, you offer them hospitality, and then you try to spring a trap. That's not journalism, Joy. That's an ambush. And it's a cheap one at that." The audience, sensing the shift in power, began to murmur. A few scattered claps broke out, quickly silenced by the tension. Joy, realizing she was losing the room, tried to pivot back to his political history. "You're deflecting, Clint. You haven't answered the question about your rhetoric." "The empty chair." Eastwood cut her off, not with a shout, but with a raised hand, a gesture of absolute authority. "The empty chair," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "It was a metaphor, Joy, about politicians who aren't there for the people. But looking at you right now, I see a different kind of empty chair. I see a chair filled with someone who is physically present, but intellectually absent." Gasps rippled through the studio. Whoopi Goldberg's eyes widened. This was a verbal decapitation on live TV. Joy sat stunned, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Intellectually absent?" she sputtered. "I have been a voice for women, for progressives, for decades. How dare you?" Eastwood shrugged, unimpressed. "You have a voice, sure. It's loud. It carries. But what are you saying with it? You spend every day tearing people down, mocking people who live differently than you, laughing at people in the middle of the country because they don't buy what you're selling. You call that progress? I call it bullying." "Bullying?" Joy laughed, a harsh, defensive sound. "I'm the bully? You're the one who made a career out of glorifying violence. You're Dirty Harry. You solve problems with a .44 Magnum." Eastwood nodded slowly. "I played a character, Joy. That's what actors do. We step into someone else's shoes to try and understand them. That's empathy. But you? You sit in that chair every day and you judge. You don't try to understand the people you disagree with. You just label them. Racist, sexist, backward. You label them so you don't have to engage with them. That's the definition of a bully. Someone who uses their power to belittle others instead of lifting them up." Joy looked around for support, but the other hosts were frozen. They knew that intervening now would be like stepping onto the tracks in front of a freight train. "I ask the tough questions," Joy insisted, her voice shaking slightly. "If you can't handle them, maybe you should stick to scripted movies." Eastwood leaned back, his demeanor shifting from disappointment to dismissal. I can handle tough questions, Joy. I've answered to studio heads, critics, and the American public for 60 years. What I don't have time for, and what I suspect your audience is tired of, is bad theater. He checked his watch, a gesture that signaled he had determined the value of his time was currently being wasted. You know, Eastwood continued, I came here to talk about a film. A story about a man trying to find his way back to grace. But you don't want to talk about that. You want to talk about me. You want to make this about Clint Eastwood the villain, so you can be Joy Behar the hero. He shook his head. But the thing about heroes, Joy, is that they don't have to tell you they're heroes. They just do the work. You're not doing the work. You're just making noise. Joy slam-dunked her hand on the table. This is my show. You are a guest in my house. You don't get to come in here and insult me. Eastwood stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and final. He buttoned his jacket with steady hands. Your house, he repeated. That's the problem, isn't it? You think this airtime belongs to you. You think the audience belongs to you. But they don't. They lend you their time. They lend you their attention. And you repay them with bitterness and division. He looked out at the audience, catching the eyes of the people in the front row. These folks came here to be entertained. They came here to see a show. Instead, they got a lecture from someone who thinks she's better than them. Sit down, Joy demanded, pointing a finger at his empty chair. We are not done. Eastwood smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. It was the smile of a man who has seen everything and fears nothing. Oh, we're done, Joy. We were done the minute you decided that your ego was more important than the truth. He reached for his lapel microphone. You see, that's the difference between us. I know when a scene is over. I know when the script has run dry. You're just going to keep ad-libbing until the lights go out, hoping someone applauds. He unclipped the microphone and set it gently on the glass table. The thump of the plastic against the glass was amplified by the boom mics, echoing through the silent studio. Whoopee! Eastwood nodded politely to the moderator. Ladies, thank you for the hospitality. It's been illuminating. He turned his back on Joy Behar, a gesture of supreme indifference. He didn't storm out. He didn't throw a tantrum. He simply walked away. He walked with the same steady, rhythmic gait that had carried him across the deserts of Spain and the streets of San Francisco. He walked like a man who had nothing left to prove. Behind him, Joy Behar was unraveling. You can't just leave, she shouted at his retreating back. This is live television. You are contractually obligated. Her voice trailed off as Eastwood disappeared behind the backstage curtain without looking back once. The cameras cut to a wide shot, showing the empty chair where the legend had sat. It was a stark visual. The empty chair, the symbol Joy had mocked, was now her reality. She was left alone with her outrage, shouting into a void that no longer cared to listen. The control room was in chaos. Producers were screaming into headsets. Whoopi Goldberg awkwardly threw to a commercial break, her face a mask of shock. We'll be right back, she stammered. But the damage was done. The segment had aired. The millions watching at home had seen it. They had seen the veil lifted. They had seen the difference between a man of substance and a woman of spectacle. Social media ignited instantly. Clips of Eastwood's calm dismantling of Behar began to circulate with the speed of a wildfire. The hashtag Clint was right began to trend before the commercial break was even over. Backstage, Eastwood was met by his publicist, who looked terrified. Clint, the publicist whispered. That was, are you okay? Eastwood adjusted his cuffs, his pulse seemingly resting at a comfortable 60 beats per minute. I'm fine, he grunted. I just don't like wasting time. And that. He gestured back toward the stage where Joy was still furiously gesturing to her producers, was a waste of time. He walked toward the exit door, pushing it open to reveal the bright sunlight of the New York afternoon. He took a deep breath of fresh air, cleansing his lungs of the recycled, toxic air of the studio. Inside, the show returned from break, but the energy was dead. Joy Behar tried to spin the narrative, calling Eastwood unhinged and unable to handle the heat. But her voice lacked its usual bite. She looked small in her chair. She looked defeated. She knew, deep down, that she had reached for the crown and had her hand slapped away. She had tried to deconstruct an icon and had only succeeded in exposing her own hollow foundations. The audience sat in an awkward stupor, unsure of whether to clap or remain silent. The spell of the show, The illusion that these hosts were the arbiters of truth had been broken. In the days that followed, the fallout was immense. Opinion pieces were written. Debates raged on cable news. But the consensus among the silent majority of Americans was clear. Clint Eastwood had said what millions of them had wanted to say for years. He had stood up to the bully. He had refused to apologize for who he was. He had drawn a line in the sand between the real world and the media bubble. The confrontation on The View wasn't just a celebrity feud. It was a cultural touchstone. It was a reminder that dignity still exists. It was a demonstration that true power doesn't come from shouting the loudest or holding the microphone. It comes from knowing who you are and refusing to be moved. Joy Behar had the platform, the lights, the cameras, and the home field advantage. But Clint Eastwood had the truth. And as he proved that day, when truth stares down performative outrage, the truth doesn't blink. Eastwood didn't need to win a shouting match. He won by refusing to participate in one. He won by walking away. And in doing so, he left Joy Behar with the one thing she fears most: irrelevance. The empty chair sat under the studio lights, a silent testament to the day the man with no name took on the woman with too many words and left her speechless. Hollywood had sent its toughest cowboy into the lion's den, and he hadn't just survived. He had tamed the lions, shamed the circus master, and walked out into the sunset, leaving the clowns to wonder why nobody was laughing anymore.